On behalf of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Foundation for Renewable Energy and Environment, welcome to today's Washington, D.C. launch of the International Energy Agency's Renewables 2018 Market Report. My name is John Banks. I'm a visiting scholar and adjunct professor here at SAIS in the Energy Resources and Environment program, and I'll be your moderator for today's proceedings. The format for today is that after some brief opening remarks here, I will ask our featured speaker, Hemi Bahar from the IEA, to present a summary of the report, after which he and I will be joined on stage by Professor John Byrne, or JB as he will insist you call him. JB will provide some framing remarks for discussion, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. Just a few opening remarks on my part. Some of us who follow the renewable energy industry are often tested as to whether we see the glass half full or half empty, and I think the IEA's report today illustrates this a little bit. There are some really truly amazing facts and issues that are highlighted here. For example, right now renewable energy currently accounts for about 10% of total global final energy consumption, and they expect that by 2023 to rise to 12% of total final consumption. At the same time, the report notes that at the current trajectory, renewable energy would reach 18% of global final energy consumption by 2040, while their sustainable development scenario suggests that renewables should be accounting for about 28% by 2040. In electricity alone, renewables will reach 30% of all electricity generation by 2023. Think about that, 5, 10, 15 years ago, to suggest that renewables would account for that much of electricity generation would have been astounding, but that is what the projection is for 2023. But at the same time, the IPCC's special report on global warming, which came out on October 10th, suggested that renewables need to reach 70 to 85% of electricity supply by 2050. So I think this IEA report does a great job in celebrating the great progress and potential for renewable energy, but at the same time noting that renewables are not on track to meet sustainable development goals, and especially in keeping temperature rises below 1.5 degrees centigrade. In the end, I tend to be a glass half full person. In the 10 years that I've been affiliated with SAIS, the interest among students in energy broadly has soared. It is now the largest concentration at SAIS. As an example, every year I see more and more students interested in the electricity sector in particular as a career path in such areas as renewables, energy efficiency, distributed resources, vehicle electrification, storage, etc. We have had to expand our existing curriculum in courses dealing with electricity, and in fact have had to add new electricity-related courses to the curriculum. We now have graduates working in an array of institutions throughout the sector, from utility regulators at the state level, national level, to FERC, to utilities such as PG&E and National Grid, and in leading energy technology companies such as Google, Apple, Vestas, Fluence, and of course, leading NGOs such as the World Bank, IFC, and the IEA. So I'm encouraged by this booming interest and talent coming through our program, and I'm hopeful in their ability to tackle the challenges related to increasing renewable energy development. On that note, it brings me to our featured speaker today. Hemi Bahar is a graduate of the SAIS Energy Program, and here he is today leading the IEA's work tracking and assessing renewable energy trends globally. He's working to inform policymakers and other stakeholders on what is happening in the industry and on highlighting approaches to tackling the challenges confronting it. Hemi, welcome back to SAIS. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. So it's actually an interesting moment for me to come back after 8 years. Thanks for organizing this event, but also I need to thank here Professor Banks and Professor Blevis for the things that they taught me, which took me to my career here, which is the ultimate truth. And someone who cannot be here today, Professor Girard, former director of the actually ERE program, helped me to get my job himself. So it's a very, very kind of a semi-emotional moment for me to come back. So my name is Hemi Bahar. I am leading renewable forecast at the IEA. This report is published every year. I'm managing a team of 7 people who does the market analysis and renewable energy forecast, which I'll present here today. Before I start, I would like to give a little bit of a context of what happened over the actually last 2 weeks, what we announced. The first one is the CO2 emissions. So we are all talking about renewables. They are growing very fast, but in reality, after 3 years of being flat, in 2017, emissions grew again, and we expect that 2018 emissions will grow again after 2017. So bad news, totally opposite of the trend that IPCC is expecting, which means emissions need to peak immediately. However, the trend we see is totally the opposite. The second one is progress in energy efficiency, which has slowed down last year, which is also not a good news because almost half of the improvements that we need to achieve in order to go towards a climate-friendly world, efficiency plays an important part. So we need to have more efficiency rather than less efficiency. And the third one, expensive energy is back. You can interpret this differently. You can interpret it's good for renewables because it's related to fossil fuels, or it's bad for renewables because there's not enough revenues and investment to invest in different sectors. Oil prices are up. They were at around 85 this morning, I think. Coal prices up, natural gas prices are up. So we are seeing going back to the trend where energy prices are becoming more expensive. On the other side, on the good side, solar PV broke new records. This is capacity. Offshore wind broke new records driven by China, both driven by China actually. And we saw significant competitive auctions reducing the costs and prices of renewables very drastically over the last few years, especially for wind and solar. I will come back to that later. On the other hand, global electricity demand is growing much faster than the energy demand, which is one of the interesting topics, but it still represents 20% of final energy consumption. So we talk a lot about electricity. It's an interesting topic. It's a growing trend, but it's only 20% today. And at the IEA, we try to look at the blind spots of the energy system, which means the sectors and users or the parts of the energy system where it represents either a large share today or it will represent a larger growth in the future, but no one is talking about them. So we looked at several sectors such as petrochemicals, air conditioners, and this book's focus is a little bit on bioenergy. Because it's a blind spot. Why we focused on bioenergy, which is not a sexy topic like solar PV and wind? The reason is this. Actually, the 50% of the renewable energy consumption comes from bioenergy. And we call it modern bioenergy because it's not the traditional use of biomass in Africa and Asia. We exclude that. That needs to go down in order to have a better, healthier life of these people living there. We are just looking at the modern technologies. And why modern bioenergy actually represents 50%? The answer is on the other side of the picture because it's not maybe very prominent in electricity, but when you look at heat and transport, bioenergy is the only technology that can directly contribute to 3 sectors at the same time. That's why we see a significant bioenergy. And on the heat side, when we are talking about heat, it's buildings and industry, which means industrial processes to produce heat. Actually, 2/3 of the bioenergy is used for industrial processes. The rest is good old hydro, PV, wind, and they are mostly prominent in the electricity sector. But one important point here, the purple part, it's the electricity from renewables in heat and transport, which is an important chunk, especially in the heat part. We basically take into account the electrification of heat and look at how renewables contribute to that electricity that is used for heating. So that's that part, which is a growing third, which I will come back to that later. So we looked at the past 5 years, and we knew at the IEA about bioenergy's role in the final energy consumption. We knew about it led the past growth because of the significant expansion in heat and transport, but we did not know that it will also lead the next 5 years' growth. It was actually surprising to us after having done the analysis. And the reason is actually very simple, because it's very, very large-scale growth in the industrial demand and buildings demand, and also transport. And especially for the long-haul transport, biofuels are the only way to decarbonize the energy system today. That's why it's growing very fast. As you can see, the big changes in solar PV, it jumped significantly in terms of its energy consumption, followed by wind and hydropower, which is stable. And when we look at how these sectors perform in terms of renewables penetration, as Professor Banks mentioned, electricity is the shining star of renewables. We all talk about it. This is our forecast for share of renewables in electricity generation in the coming 5 years. And then we will see that it grows by 1 percentage point every year, reaching about 30%, which is a good news. It's an important deployment. Solar PV and wind is leading that. We will come back to that later. But two other sectors which are not performing as well are heat and transport, as I mentioned, in terms of share of renewables, despite being the largest consumer areas. As you can see, the transport share is almost flat because oil demand is still growing, and biofuels and electric vehicles are not growing fast enough to turn that trend in terms of the share increase. On the heat side, heat sector is complicated. The share of renewables are growing slowly, led by bioenergy, especially in industry. We will come back to that later as well in the focus. When we put all these together and try to look at what is the share of renewables in the overall total final energy consumption, is, as you can see, the red bar, which is extremely close to the heat. The reason why is very simple, because most of the consumption is on the heat side. So transport sectors, lower share pushing the global share down, electricity is pushing it up, heat keeps it the same, so you see that it's only at the heat side. So we expect the share of renewables to grow from 10.4% to 12.4%. The numbers were given by Professor Banks. I'm not going to repeat it. We are not on track, definitely. But it is important to look at the total final energy consumption for one important reason. Most of the targets that we have, European Union targets, SDG 7 United Nations targets, are based on how much energy on the total final energy consumption side. So it's important to look at this indicator, which will define if we are on track or not. When we look at the country and regional differences, European Union is today, or in 2017, is the largest consumer of renewable energy in all sectors. But in the future, this picture will change slightly. So China, which has incredible drivers to deploy renewables, not only to tackle climate change, but to tackle air pollution, which is an important factor for renewables growth in China. As you can see, China's growth exceeds European Union in our forecast. It becomes the largest consumer of renewable energy. This is driven by electricity sector growth, but also they are pushing the bioenergy on the heat and biofuel side in order to improve their energy security, because they import all oil. One important point here is Brazil. As you can see in the red dots where we show the shares, Brazil has by far the highest share in terms of renewables. Why is that? There are two reasons. It's a bioeconomy, which means that Brazil is using a lot of bioenergy in heat and transport sector. Most of the Brazilian cars are flexi-fuel, which means they can change between biofuels and gasoline. Actually, biofuel production for sugar ethanol in Brazil is already competitive with gasoline, no-brainer. So they switch back and forth to customers based on the price. No incentives, no mandates. And incredible hydropower and electricity generation. And we expect Brazilian share to continue to increase, which is tough at that rate, but it's about 45%. The rest of the world remains about 12%, United States, Brazil, and India. Most of the improvements are on the electricity side. We will see that in the coming years. So What we try to do in the electricity sector, we look at the policies and their impact on renewable deployment. And as you can see, there's an important policy transition from government-set tariffs or feed-in tariffs for the purchase of renewables to competitive schemes, which are basically auctions that developers compete to get the price. And over the last 5 years, the deployment was mostly driven by these feed-in tariffs and government-set tariffs. But we are moving towards a different direction. Our last year's forecast estimated 40% of the growth will come from competitive schemes. This year's forecast is about 60% coming from competitive schemes. The reason why is that many more countries are introducing auction schemes. It's the cheaper way of purchase renewables, especially wind and solar. And on the right-hand side, you will see some of the auction results that we have been collecting for offshore wind, onshore wind, solar PV, and bioenergy. As you can see, we are seeing a very low prices at about $30 to $40. And solar PV prices are almost competing with onshore wind. You see an incredible improvement offshore wind, which is slowly coming to the United States from Europe. These are the important trends that we see. But these auction prices are one part of the story. On the other hand, when you look at the average cost of these projects, excluding subsidies, you will see much higher prices for solar PV. But the world is moving towards that direction. Cheaper renewables, different business models, combining auctions with corporate PPAs and other type of merchant activities. Our forecast expects about 1 terawatt of renewable capacity coming online. Just to give you an idea, this is 70% of global capacity growth covered by renewables. When we talk about capacity and renewables, everyone says that why you are talking about capacity, what about their generation? Actually, 67% of the generation growth will also come from renewables. So we are talking about the similar numbers here now at this point because of the utilization rate of other fuels are decreasing, especially in countries where power demand is not growing. As you can see here, China is the largest country by far. It will represent alone 40% of the global renewable capacity growth in the coming 5 years. Incredible numbers there, most of it from solar PV and wind, but also hydropower, followed by European Union, which our forecast has improved since new 2030 targets are implemented, are being approved, and there are many more countries trying to rush to reach their 2020 targets. Followed by United States, which we revised down the forecast this year due to the new administration changes about the Clean Power Plan and several trade agreements that make renewables less competitive. One of the important points also is that tax reform is good for the corporates, but in terms of the new projects for renewables, which are based on tax credits, the value of tax credits decline with this, so the competitiveness of renewables as well. The other countries are growing significantly. India is making a big jump on solar PV. Its goal is to install, basically quadruple their solar PV capacity in just 5 years. And it's in the forecast, it's the 4th largest country, followed by Japan and Brazil. I would like to highlight an important point here is the other part. This other part is growing very fast, which means that renewables are being deployed in many parts of the world outside of these large economies. We also have an accelerated case. We look at the policies that are basically not implemented or challenges of the countries based on 3 major issues. One is the policy uncertainty, the other one is the grid integration or network availability, and the third one is the availability of affordable financing. And if countries meet those challenges in the coming 5 years, actually renewable capacity can be 25% higher in terms of growth and reach 1.3 terawatts, which is significantly higher share than today. When we look at which technologies are leading, there is an important shift as well here. In the coming 5 years, solar PV capacity growth will be larger than all other renewables combined. Why solar PV is a winning technology? As you can see in the graph, distributed PV makes a difference. When you compare solar PV utility scale projects versus wind utility scale projects, they are in terms of equal in growth. But when you look at the other side of the picture, which is the distributed generation, the picture looks completely different. And we also look at the accelerated case by technology, and actually distributed generation growth shows the largest possible expansion. There are a lot of challenges in terms of regulatory and administrative, but it's a black box, which means that once you reach a certain point and the regulatory environment is correct, it will grow regardless of what you try to do. Sometimes it will grow much faster than you expect, and you try to break it, but it's an important point to mention. I talked about competitive versus administrative policies. We also looked at the distributed generation policies, country by country, region by region, and then in the US, everyone is talking about net metering. Actually, globally, 51% of the policy that remunerates generation from distributed solar PV is with fixed tariffs, mainly driven by China, and in some European countries, such as German, residential systems are still remunerated by a fixed tariff. This fixed tariff can be considered high or low. We don't make a judgment here. We just say that the policy type is this. But we are seeing an important trend also to move from retail tariff, which we call net metering, towards a more value-based tariff. What we mean by a value-based tariff is a tariff that is usually between the wholesale price or a retail price. We call it value-based because it's an easier way to express that regulators, governments, or policymakers are including certain costs and benefits on distributed PV generation. In Australia, for instance, they include CO2 reduction cost into the tariff. In the US, in many places, they include the avoided cost of investing in the distribution grid or additional cost of investing in the additional grid, which gives a more value-based picture, which is a growing trend, which will be the second largest share in terms of our growth in the distributed generation. Moving from electricity to biofuels and electric vehicles, we expect biofuels production to continue to grow, mostly from the conventional biofuels, which means sugar ethanol or corn ethanol. But the leading country is not the United States here. United States leads the current production, but in terms of growth, we expect Brazil and other Latin American countries and Asia to deal that. What is the driver in Asia? It's important to mention. It is energy security, because they import oil. They would like to use their own resources to produce biofuels. An important highlight on China. China's biofuel expansion is from waste corn, which means they've been saving corn for food, usage of food for a lot of years. Now this corn is basically rotten in the stocks, and it's in a perfect shape and sugar level to produce biofuels. They decided not to use that for food purposes because it's not useful anymore. They are transforming that into biofuels. That's why a significant growth is coming, which is actually combined with a policy that basically makes this production and consumption of biofuels happen in the next 5 years. Brazil, as I mentioned, is a bioeconomy. Its new policy on Renewable Bio will attract a lot of investment going forward. We did not forget about electric vehicles. Everyone is talking about them. It's also a very sexy topic. Electric vehicles are not renewables. It's important to look at how much energy they consume and where this energy is coming from. We estimated that about 30% of, in 2023, renewable electricity will go to electric vehicles. The rest, so most of the electric vehicles will be fueled by coal and gas, unfortunately, and a little bit of nuclear. That's the sad truth. But at least the increasing share of renewables is contributing to that. They have another important benefit, which is emissions in the cities. That's no doubt that it will contribute significantly. But when you look at the picture in 2023, biofuels represent still the over 85% of all renewable consumption in the transport sector, followed by actually not cars or electric vehicles, but rail. Rail's consumption of renewables is much higher than cars. And one important point when we talk about cars, I know we all talk about Tesla, but in Asia, two three-wheelers, which means tuk-tuks and motorbikes, which are also included in this forecast, represents about 70% of electricity consumption of electric vehicles in the world, including buses, not cars. So it's a different trend, which is a little bit hidden because we all talk about electric cars. This year we also looked at one sector, which is another blind spot in my opinion, is aviation. It's difficult to decarbonize. It represents a significant demand growth in the coming 5 years because of growing passengers mainly in Asia. But no one is talking about it for its decarbonization. Obviously, current technology is not allowing to electrify a flight from London to New York, and I'm not sure whether it will come in the coming 5 to 10 years, to be very honest with you. So the only way to decarbonize transport is biofuels in this case, and more specifically advanced biofuels, which means non-food crop biofuels, which aviation is aiming from. Currently, with the $7 oil price, we calculated this 4 or 5 months ago when the oil price was $70. The difference in cost premium was about 40% with the commercial aviation biofuel. And we turned that number into a per passenger flight cost premium from London to different destinations. And when you look at this, you see that it will cost $10 more for a flight to London to New York or Delhi, which is about less than 3% of an economy flight ticket, probably, and less than 1% of a business class ticket. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a hold on average price of the airlines when they sell these costs. They didn't share with us, but at least we have an estimation of how much does it mean approximately. Having said that, IEA does not argue that passengers should pay, don't get me wrong. It's a way to express the cost premium. The idea is that government policy, industry, and passengers should somehow come together in order to decarbonize aviation sector. Another big sector is the maritime shipping, which we did not look at this year, probably we'll look at next year, but it's also important to mention. One other important point, again, renewables and efficiency. If you were to calculate this cost premium on an efficient aircraft, we took the average fleet here, the efficient aircrafts will actually reduce automatically cost premium by 15%. So that's also an important point to mention. Going back to the unknown giant or unspoken giant, which is heat. So as I said, bioenergy is the technology that is leading here. Currently, 50% of renewables are consumed in buildings, 50% are consumed in industry. This is bioenergy's share, as you can see, in different sectors, but the rest looks very interesting. So on the industry side, we see that mostly bioenergy is dominating, but electrification and renewable district heating also plays an important role. But when you look at the building side, the picture looks a little bit different. Actually, in our forecast, bioenergy loses its first position against the others combined. And this blue bar that you see, which represents the largest increase, is the electrification of heat. And what we do, as I said, we calculate how much renewables are consumed when your radiator gives you an electricity heat. We back calculate that based on the share of renewables in the system. And it's an important trend which will continue. Our World Energy Outlook 2019, which will be, 18, will be published next month. We'll look at very detailed on the electrification sectors, but it's an important trend to mention. Just one point before I finish on the industry. Industrial sectors are usually difficult to decarbonize, and they are mostly run on coal, oil, and gas. The important point here is that there are some sectors which are energy intensive, and their share of renewables is 5 to 6%, even less. Cement is the sector that we chose, which is the largest growth in terms of renewables in the coming 5 years in energy intensive sectors. And there's a policy angle to it. So you can see the red dots here represent the share of waste and bioenergy in the cement production in different regions and countries. And EU stands out with 25%. Actually, in Germany and UK, it's over 50%, this share. This is the European Union average. And it's waste and bioenergy used in cement production. When you look at the countries which are the largest producer of cement, such as India and China, the share is close to zero. Why is that? Is it an economic issue? Is it a policy issue? We looked at it very closely. When you look at the economics, the waste and bioenergy versus coal, they are almost in par in many parts of the world. And then we ask ourselves the question, why people are not using it? The reason is that there is no price on waste, which means that in many developing countries, the waste is not priced, such as you can basically dump the waste wherever you want, or landfill it, or burn it, which means you waste the waste, because it can be used as an energy source to produce actually industrial processes. And we looked at it, if those countries implement the best policies that are in place in the United States, European Union, and we looked at the potential. The potential is significant. Actually, if this potential can be realized with waste management policies, we can see actually renewables share doubling in the cement sector. And this is an important trend we looked at, because usually the sectors which don't have agricultural residues or waste products when they produce on the site, they have very low bioenergy products. And then these sectors are the largest growth. So we didn't look at the paper and pulp industry because it's already very high. We didn't look at the sugar and ethanol industry or food industry because they already produce a lot of bioenergy because their processes includes that. But when you look at iron and steel, almost zero. When you look at chemicals, very low. And we chose cement because it has a promising growth. And just putting everything together, we also have an accelerated case, as I mentioned. This is the electricity sector accelerated case. 50% comes from solar PV, other 30% from wind, and the rest for other technologies. The bioenergy part of it is actually important, although it looks small. It's also coming from waste to energy. We looked at the opportunities in Asia with a significant urbanization trends, and then better waste management, and then you can actually mobilize that waste to produce energy. It's one of the things. And on the other side, we look at the bioenergy's potential. We put together our accelerated case on road transport biofuels. We looked at cement, sugar and ethanol industry, and aviation biofuels growth. And this result was also surprising to us, that the upside potential in the coming 5 years is very similar to electricity. And all this upside, most of it, does not require a single crop-based, does not require kilometers squares of crop-based, the new crops to be installed. It's based on waste. That's why we are trying to communicate that waste is gold. You just need to have policies to mobilize it. Just a few conclusions, put them all together. We will probably discuss this during the panel discussion. Everyone is talking about that wind and solar PV costs are so low now, we don't need policies anymore. This is incorrect, because they are different technologies, and electricity markets with their current design are not designed to integrate them in a way that exists. That's why you need some kind of a policy to push to basically pull them into the market and achieve the investment. So we are not talking about any more high financial incentives, but we are talking about a policy framework. We can discuss this later, that will allow renewables deployment and investment and better integration. As I mentioned, modern bioenergy leads the renewable growth in the coming 5 years because of their existing heat and transport, and its upside potential is significant, especially in China, India, Brazil, and the United States, in the European Union. One important point, we will come back to that in the discussion probably, is the sustainability issue. So this is the key for the additional bioenergy growth. We need to have sustainable bioenergy. There are good policies in the world that is related to that. In California, in Brazil, in the European Union, policies need to be implemented to deploy further bioenergy. And if you want to go towards the IPCC or climate goals that we have, we don't need only renewables, but we need also a lot of energy efficiency and other clean energy technologies in order to reduce carbon in our systems. And we need more electrification of the end-use sectors. We need more alignment between efficiency and renewable policies. We need more enhanced use of direct renewables in heating, and also stronger policies, this is over the long term, to give incentives to produce more kind of an industrial processes or products such as hydrogen. On this note, I'm finishing the presentation. This is the team who produced this book together, and I'm looking forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Make sure we got our mics on here. Thank you, Hemi. As I mentioned, I'm going to ask JB to provide some framing comments to get our discussion going, and then turning it to audience Q&A.
Sure.
So JB.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Byrne, and I'm with the Foundation for Renewable Energy and Environment. I also wear a couple of academic hats in addition, but the foundation was created as an effort to do exactly what Amy described, which is how to figure out, on the one hand, to meet the climate objectives that we need, and how to make renewable energy and energy efficiency be able to carry that burden. So that's sort of our thing, and I'm going to just go through a couple of points that I thought were really important on. So this report, is you may have picked up from the presentation, identifies, in addition to a general picture of the renewable energy market worldwide, focuses in on bioenergy, and does this. I think it's kind of an interesting idea, and I hope that this idea will continue to be used in the series, which is to talk about blind spots, things where maybe we don't understand as well as we should about how renewable energy markets are developing. And in this case, it was focused on bioenergy, which I think is, hopefully, I think Hami's presentation is pretty persuasive. It's very important, and we have to figure out how to look at bioenergy in a proper way. I do want to offer a couple of cautionary points. I think it's the normal thing when you're going to talk about bioenergy and its expansion. And particularly from a climate perspective, it's very important that we try and get that right. It's a complex carbon balance issue for our use of bioenergy. If we are going to use biological sources, we're going to have to look to things like short rotation crops and restrict ourselves to that in order not to get ourselves in that carbon balance issue. If we're going to use waste, which is heavily what the IEA report indicates, we need to, again, also be careful in the case of that use, so that we don't, in effect, incentivize waste as a way to get the benefits of bioenergy. So it's a tricky piece. We need to be careful not to put in competition land uses for energy crops against food crops. We know this, but we also need to be very careful as we develop this, that these bioresources are critical to the health of our ecosystems, and we need to be very careful about the stress that we might put on those ecosystems if we are not thinking this through. So this is not to say that the caution is don't go so fast on bioenergy. I mean, I think that's an interesting question, and hopefully we'll have a few rounds on that one. But what I would like to say is, rather than it being a caution to not to think about bioenergy, I would say it's the other way around. We need better planning and better policy in order to figure out when, where, and how we might use bioenergy. So I think that's the remark that I'd like to make on the general picture that Hami's given, or really that IEA has given, and Hami was kind enough to put together for us in a digestible form. So, so that said, I'd like to then focus on a bit of the points, the specifics on the bioenergy opportunity. As Hami indicated, renewable heat is very, very important. It's a fast-growing opportunity. This is where we're using largely waste in order to provide heat services to industry and to buildings. This opportunity is significant, and I think handled properly can be a very important one for our future. And you could see the forecast that IEA is looking at is to see a great deal of growth there. I do want to mention, though, that the putting in place of an infrastructure that can do that is still pretty spotty. You can look in parts of the European Union and you can look in the US, and after that, you don't see a lot of infrastructure that's needed to really make renewable heat a sizable market share. Right now it is in those two areas, but not in others. And the same thing happens, as Hemi nicely pointed out. This is a renewable source that can play in all three of the markets. It can play not only in heat, but it can in electricity, but also in heat and in transport. But again, our use of it on transport, and certainly there are a lot of critics of U.S. policy on the use of bioenergy in the transport sector, and I think the criticism in many ways is valid. We need to be very careful about how we think about it. We do have a model in what Brazil has tried to do that I think, again, is something we can learn from. And my takeaway in both the heat case and in the transport case is that while there are limited, large markets, but limited markets, we could take the opportunity to learn from those countries that have been able to build these opportunities into their economic structures and into their policy systems. And I think that's something that's very important. We didn't get to solar thermal in the round, but again, solar thermal has a big, big play. But if you look to China's utilization of it, it's astonishing. And about 80% of what we look for in solar thermal you'll find having been developed in the Chinese market. So it's a big opportunity. It's happening only in a few countries, but that may also give us a hint as to how to figure out how to balance economic structure and how to design policy in order to make these markets go faster. So that's sort of my comments on bioenergy and thoughts, and looking forward to hearing what you would say about that. I have a couple of more general comments because this is the renewable energy market, not only bioenergy, so I just wanted to make a couple of comments there as well. And in that vein, I think the renewable energy market is part of a larger sector, the energy sector, that is under very rapid change, and I'd like to just highlight two issues there. One has to do with trying to do any kind of forecast like the IEA tried, and knowing that we have something akin to a transformative change taking place in mobility and a transformative change taking place in storage. I think these are on the scale of what we've seen in communications and computation. We are going to see things that we never thought about, for example, in storage, that are going to come across now in the next 5 to 10 years. That makes it difficult to say exactly how to position renewable energy, but I do think that in both cases they are cutting in favor of us growing faster. And I'm sort of a glass half full as well as John. I worked with the IPCC for a long, long time, and I have to say, in the 90s, when you looked at the hill that we thought had to be climbed then, it looked impossible. We have climbed that hill. We found out, of course, that there's a mountain behind that hill, and we have to go much higher than we did before. But I do see in these transformative opportunities ways to accelerate change against what we might otherwise predict. So I just offer that as one point to bear in mind. A second is the architecture of the energy system is changing. We are moving away from a highly centralized and more large-scale supply-oriented system to one that's much more distributed. And the case of PV or photovoltaics is a really good example of how significant that kind of change can be. I believe that change is also going to introduce opportunities for new investment and for new, basically, community and individual choice that are going to drive development of new markets that we currently are only seeing at a modest level, but I, again, half full. I think those markets are going to take off, and one of the things that that you're seeing is where that choice has been opened up and where that architecture has been adjusted to make it possible for greater choice to be made. You've seen rapid growth in in the U.S., maybe you could say these days that something like 60% or so of electrical energy would come from renewable sources by 2030 in California. I don't think you really would have seen that even 10 years ago as necessarily a reliable number, but when you see how fast the choice market is working in California, you get a sense that maybe those kinds of growth rates are possible. And the last point that I just want to make, which Amy emphasized toward the end of his remarks, if there's a blind spot on bioenergy, I think there's been an enduring blind spot on energy conservation. After all these years, we still are not exactly sure what the heck it means and how exactly to go about getting it. We know the potential is enormous, and we always underachieve against potential. And so I would hope, too, that we would see conservation in conjunction with the renewable sources as the key that we need to figure out. How do we bring these together and not just silo one and then the other? So those are some thoughts on what we might be able to discuss this morning.
Thank you, JB. I wanted to ask Amy one question and pose one theme here before we turn to the audience. And this comment is in large part for students, I think, that may be listening. A big message that comes out in this report is the importance of policy, right? So technology matters, the fuels matter, innovation in technology matters. But a big point I think that comes across in this report is the importance of policy and administrative structures and frameworks surrounding the incentives to deploy renewables. To paraphrase former Secretary of Treasury Lawrence Summers, I think policy predictability and stability are a good stimulus the best stimulus for decarbonization. On that note, I noticed that, and you mentioned this, that the policy incentives for renewables and electricity seem to be moving away from fixed price mechanisms, administrative mechanisms, to more competitive mechanisms. When you look in the body of the report, it looks like in biofuels, there still is a tendency to use mandates and quotas and more sort of strict administrative approaches. I'm wondering if you can maybe comment on sort of that difference, or am I reading that correctly? Do we see a shift in the type of policies supporting biofuels as opposed to what we've noticed in the shift in renewables and electricity?
So the biofuels policies remained, you get the right point there. It's mostly on the mandate sides because end user products is more difficult to decarbonize. That's the first point. And the only place in the world currently, and a few other Latin American countries, but Brazil, except Brazil, biofuels are not in par with gasoline price. That is the truth. And without that cost reduction happening, it is difficult to do it without this kind of demand pull kind of policies. And it is also different than biofuels production is also different because cost reduction production potential is also limited. Why? Because it's based on a feedstock. So the feedstock cost matters. Feedstock cost is actually is a market in many things, but that's why it is important that we highlight that we need to move towards advanced biofuels where feedstock is huge, is not competing with any food, but however we have been significantly behind on this. You need both technology push and demand pull policies to attract advanced biofuels, which we need because if we are going towards a policy which towards a world where we need to decarbonize the long-haul shipping, both aviation and marine, biofuels is the only solution, and if we are going to scale that up, advanced biofuels are actually the only solution. So that's why we are at the innovation stage. Advanced biofuels are still very low. It needs to be come to the market, and they are also using a lot of waste products. as well, some of the technologies, but they only represent in our forecast only 1% of global biofuels production. That's it in 2023. So it really needs to scale up. Policies play a key role in this, which has been falling behind. Now there's a push in the European Union to the mandate on advanced biofuels. Again, just a specific mandate on biofuels. California has a similar one, and we are going towards this kind of a direction. I think there needs to be still time, but oil price can change this picture. So the break-even point of an advanced biofuels is $110 right now. The best advanced biofuels case, the break-even point with the oil price is $110. So
110.
$110. So that's the price that we need to see in order for them to be competitive.
If I could just follow up quickly on that transport side. A few weeks ago here, we had a guest speaker, Daniel Sperling, who was speaking about his most recent book entitled Three Revolutions in the Transport Sector. And what he was talking about is the move toward electric vehicles, the increasing theme of shared mobility, and then, of course, automated vehicles. I'm wondering, has the IEA thought about those three trends as they figure in the mix of biofuels and electrification in the different subsectors? So these sort of broader transformations that are taking place, shared mobility, EVs, and automated vehicles, if you're starting to think about how those impact your assessment of the markets, the transport market.
So we think that biofuels and electric vehicles are complementary. Complementary in a sense that some of the market will grow on the electric vehicle side. Biofuels remain the largest one because it's used currently today, and it doesn't require a huge infrastructural investment because the stations are there. Yeah. It's the same logic for EVs. You need to have a lot of investment, which is happening today, to basically deploy all this infrastructure to basically make it ready to scale up faster. That's why we see them complementary. We expect electric vehicles, electricity consumption to triple in just 5 years. But policy, just to connect with policies, there's a lot of policy support on electric vehicles today, a lot of grants given, a lot of tax rebates, and so on and so forth. But we will see, I think, in coming years that they will be in par with the combustion engines. And one important point to make here, the pie graph that I showed where electric vehicles only represent 5 to 7% by 2023, it's actually misleading. Why it's misleading? Because it's energy terms. When you look at actually kilometers or miles per passenger per fuel consumed, electric vehicles are much more efficient than internal combustion engines. So we will look at that part in the future as well, how they are playing a role in the more passengers on efficiency side. So,
okay. And then one last question, just to we spoke about this a little bit before, and maybe this will prompt on the electricity side. I think there was one statistic in there where you suggested that the number of countries that will have 10 to 20% variable renewable energy in their electricity mix will triple. And that's 10 to 20% variable renewables in the market, much less those countries that have beyond 20%. And that will continue to pose some grid integration challenges. And I'm wondering and that there are obviously strategies that you suggest in the report to address those integration challenges. But I'm wondering if you can sort of outline what you hear in your assessments and your travels. What are the concerns on grid integration, and maybe a little bit of how you approach answering that? What are some of the methods of addressing those grid integration challenges?
So about 90% of the growth that we expect is just on the renewables market in the coming 5 years will come from wind and solar. The 10% is the rest. So we are talking about this growth, which is huge, just coming from variable sources. Just a fact. That we expect. It can be even higher. In our accelerated case forecast, it's even higher. In terms of the generation, they represent 75% of the generation growth of renewables. So we are seeing a huge move towards wind and solar. We have a system integration unit at the IEA that looks at these issues very closely. And I deleted that slide from my presentation because it was becoming too long. But we are seeing an incredible move that with this growth, the countries with the majority of the renewable wind and solar generation in 2023 will happen in countries with 10 to 20% share of variable renewables, which is an incredible move from today, which is 5 to 10%. So what does it mean to us? We divided countries into 6 phases, phase 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and we identified what are the challenges and what are the requirements that is needed when you move towards those phases. And phase 1 is basically less than 5%, which means that you don't actually have to do much. The system should be able to cope with that. When you move towards a 2, 3, and 4, you need to invest in additional flexibility. You need to look at the locational value. You need to look at battery storage, and so on and so forth.
Transmission.
But this is not, of course, transmission, but this is not a technical issue. This is a cost issue. How you can integrate them in a cost-effective way. I mean, you can simply spend a lot of money and put all the batteries around the world and integrate 100% renewable. I mean, there's no problem, but it will be very expensive. The good balance is that how we can optimize existing sources such as demand-side response, which doesn't require a lot of investment, such as using available flexibility better, pricing flexibility better in the market, but also doing a better power market optimization, taking into account that wind and solar exists. Many utilities and transmission system operators are a little bit conservative on that side, we all know, because it's new for them and they are responsible to keeping the lights on. It's an important role that they play, and they don't want to take any risks on this, which is also a little bit understandable on that side. But there are countries in the world which reached already 60% of share of variable renewables in the world, such as Denmark, such as Ireland. Yeah. These are specific cases, obviously, which has a lot of interconnections. They are operating in a fully interconnected market, the same market design, but there are lessons to learn from these. And after we used all our available sources, which are cheap, then investing in new transmission capacity, then storage, pumped hydro storage. There's a lot of potential in that we see in the coming years. They will come in a world. And 6th phase, when you reach about 70 to 80%, you need to have not only look at electricity, but combination of all sectors. So you need to look at when electric EVs are charged, how their batteries can be used as storage to the system. You need to look at the heat. You need to look at smart efficiency systems, where they will turn on and off your heating system in a way with the real pricing of electricity. This is the future. But there's a lot of steps to go still there.
Yes. Good, thank you very much. So we'll turn it over to audience questions. There are some microphones that can be brought to you, please. I think we have a hand over here. And please identify yourself as you ask, please. Thank you.
Good morning, Doug Faulkner, SICE class of 79, and now chair of the Federal Bioenergy Advisory Committee. A suggestion and a question for Mr. Bahar. You didn't mention anything in your comments about biomass being used to replace chemicals or petroleum and chemicals. I know it's a very small slice right now, but it could be a huge driver in terms of the profitability for making other types of bioenergy go. And so I suggest that's something that you guys ought to start looking at. A question is, given the importance of bioenergy, why has it become such a 4-letter word in the last 10 years?
Wow. Are you thinking of a particular market or globally?
Well, in the developed world, especially biofuels, has a lot of negativity attached to it, and I think unfairly and unwisely.
So, very good question. And on the chemical side, we have a chemicals forecast of bioenergy. Is actually the 2nd largest growth in the energy-intensive industries after cement. We didn't show it because, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. It's in the book, We talk about it a little bit. It's biochemicals. Probably we may focus on it next year, but I don't want to promise anything. So we will go year by year, this kind of additional analysis. Very good point. I agree with
Yes.
you. We released a petrochemicals report showing us a blind spot, but bioenergy use in there, it's another blind spot within the blind spot, I will say. That's the, and on the bioenergy side, bioenergy is a controversial topic. So there's a lot of studies on life cycle assessments about corn ethanol in the United States. When the studies released 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they showed a disastrous picture. New studies showed a much better picture than that, and so on and so forth. So we are well aware that it's a complex topic. There's a lot of myths and facts in it, to be very frank. There's a lot of opposition to it. But some part of it that we think at the IEA, some are grounded, but some are not really grounded. And our bioenergy roadmap that we released last year actually looks at very detailed on what are the sustainability issues and looks at myths and facts a little bit. And I'll come back to the same residues, waste, and agricultural issues. There's a lot of waste that is not used in the world. Just before going to new crops, there's a lot of waste which is wasted in many industries in many parts of the world, which is burned in the field without using. So I think, and we estimated the potential of this waste. It's enormous. Even if you leave some part on the ground for the soil's health, it's really huge to use that. Many countries do not use it. It's period. And we are trying to convince policymakers that use available resources you have in order to start the process. And the second point that I make is advanced biofuels. It's a key issue that technological improvements that we need to achieve. I think if you ask me what is the next stage of it is the advanced biofuels. Like we are very falling behind it. Our long-term models show a significant requirement of advanced biofuels in order to reach those 2 degrees goals. And the third one, if you are going to use bioenergy in the future, that much of bioenergy, which is in the IPCC report as well, we need to find a way to capture and reuse the CO2. So that's another point that needs to be innovated if we are going towards that route. But IPCC report also highlighted this is possible with right policies to use more bioenergy. But politically, it is sensitive.
Lady right here.
Thanks. My name is Fei Yu. I'm from the Asian Development Bank. I'm the North American Deputy Representative. Thanks very much for this comprehensive overview of the renewable energy picture. We have been doing some, I'd like to further explore your point on distributed energy being the future. So we've been doing some pilot projects and also smaller scale projects in mini-grid, microgrids in more remote areas of our developing member countries. So the challenges we have faced has been that the issue of financing. So for these areas that mini-grids and microgrids are attractive, usually they're remote. They can't connect to the national grid. So the issue of how do you put together the financing, it would have a big impact on how distributed energy can really help these regions. So from our experience, for a project that we did in India, we provided 80% grant financing for mini-grids in Indian villages. So if this cannot be done on a more commercial level or more self-sustained level, then I don't see distributed energy really going as fast as we would like it to be.
So we did last year an analysis on off-grid and mini-grids. This year we couldn't repeat because it's very time intensive to do this. But just a few highlights on this. Most of these parts of the world use diesel generators in order to produce electricity, which is very expensive. We looked at the economics of it, and in terms of the economics, it makes sense. There is an economic value that will bring, because you replaced a very expensive diesel in these parts of the world, and with combining diesel with hybrid grids, combining diesel with solar PV, or increasing the battery storage, using both at the same time, not using more, because this investment in that diesel generator is already done, so it will stay there, unfortunately. So how you can decrease the diesel consumption and improve renewables, that's a question. And we looked at the cost gap, and in many places, the more you use in hospitals or in like commercial spaces, it makes sense to use those mini grids. But the biggest issue is that to convince people about the economics. It's the same thing about efficiency. The problem is that economically it makes sense, it's no-brainer, but it's a different technology. For diesel, you buy a diesel generator, your cost is distributed over the lifetime of diesel because you buy fuel. In this case, there's no fuel, but there's a huge investment upfront, which is same as energy efficiency. You need to make that investment. And I think it's important to use new financing mechanisms, such as green bonds or some type of a financing structure that reduces the risk of these products. There are good cases in parts of the world, such as in Indonesia, in my opinion, but it needs to be scaled up, and I think development banks should play an important role in this. There is no other way that it will happen, by the way. But we see in our forecast, actually, off-grid PV, we also include mini-grids in that, capacity to actually quadruple in just 5 years, and provide more than 80 million people initial access to electricity. So it's an important role that needs to be made, which will never be electrified in some parts of Africa because of the costs.
I just reinforce on the point that you're raising, that I think the need really is not to treat the microgrid in this particular context as though it's an urban model. It's not an urban model, and you need to match what is the rhythm and metabolism of the rural economy with this application. And when you do that, I think it works well. Just as on a pilot project that we did in Neymangol and Xinjiang, Qinghai, we developed these technologies, but with a financing mechanism in which communities paid, when they went to market with their goods, with their agricultural goods, they paid as a percentage of what was the sale in the market. That's how the debt was handled, rather than this upfront mechanism where you really are then making it impossible for people to choose this option in a significant way. And it ended up working quite well, and there are a large number of these systems now in those and other provinces in China because of that matching of what is the metabolism of the rural economy with payment for that energy system. So I think if you get that right, I think that's actually a solvable problem, and there are really good examples in different parts of the world for how that has been achieved.
There's a big policy issue on that as well. If the grid will reach to that point in coming 2-3 years, all the investment is gone. So you need to make sure in terms of planning that if some private company or some entity or a corporation together will make that investment, it has to make sure that whether the grid will come to that point or not. That's the biggest uncertainty that many companies have, and that requires an important planning.
And you can also integrate, just like you would at that point. If you have good functioning systems, you should integrate them with. So that is a planning function that if that circumstance does happen. But we have an awful lot of our fellow human beings who are not going to see that anytime soon, and there are practical solutions.
Up front right here.
Hi, I'm Xiao. I'm a second-year ERE student here at SAIS who's taking Professor Banks' electricity market class. So in my classes, we mainly focused on the generation side, especially. Also, the former classes I took at SAIS are mainly about electricity generation from maybe renewable energy. So that's why in that side, there's no so much biofuel talked about in my former classes. That's why it's very interesting to hear about this. My question is regarding to the biofuel about the. So it seems that it's now taking a huge percent, especially in the growing like Brazil or in transportation. But about that, I understand that it will have less like emissions compared to fossil fuel, but since it's still carbon dioxide, and also I read about an article about there's land regarding to land changes, especially forests cutting down or something in Brazil. I understand maybe for pollution, there will be significant change, especially for particulates like decreasing, but is there like a specific way to calculate the reduce of carbon dioxide or any other greenhouse emissions regarding to if you use a lot of biofuels?
So we looked at emissions analysis actually in the book. If you go to the biofuel section, we actually looked at the same question that you're asking, if they provide any emission benefits with different particulate matters, NOx, SOx, like all these emissions parts. And our analysis showed that in countries where there's an old fleet, which means that the cars and trucks are between 20 to 30 years old, which means they are very inefficient. And we looked at, usually they use diesel, and we said that if they use biodiesel instead of diesel, how much reduction we will see in certain emissions. And then in old fleets, we realized that there's an incredible benefits of using biodiesel rather than diesel in achieving 10 to 60% depending on the emission level. This is tailpipe emissions. But for efficient cars or new cars, this benefits is very low. It actually doesn't make any sense because the cars are already using the latest technology on the emissions. We basically gave that message. If you are in an old country with a lot of aging fleet and long scrappage age, you better use, in terms of the transitional level, biofuels in order to get immediate, we call it immediate air pollution benefits, okay? So that's on the side. Related to the life cycle assessment of the bioenergy, forestry and stuff. In our forecast, we include unsustainable bioenergy. We are not hiding it. The part in ASEAN, in Malaysia and Indonesia, it's coming from palm oil, and which has a huge forestation issues. In Brazil, I disagree with that. Brazil has a very good forest management policies actually, and then Brazil sugar ethanol production is basically producing 60 to 80% GHG reductions in overall. So, but there is a ugly part of the picture which we are well aware. Biodiesel production from palm oil, which is an important issue in ASEAN countries, Indonesia and Malaysia, and it needs to stop. But just one number that I would like to give here is that the palm oil use in energy on biofuels is only 10%. The other 90% is food and cosmetics sector.
That's right.
So in order to reduce that consumption, actually you need policy on the demand side rather than on the supply side, because probably most of the makeup or anything that we use or anything that we eat has kind of a palm oil in it, which is coming mostly from Indonesia and Malaysia, which is unsustainable.
Right here in the middle.
Hi, I'm Julia Selker. I'm an intern in Congress. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the renewable fuel standard or other policies that could push us towards advanced biofuels.
Sorry. So renewable fuel standards actually played an important role in the U.S. to achieve this kind of transport. And U.S. is a very particular case. When you look at the U.S. energy demand and compare it to other countries such as Brazil, China, European Union countries, transport demand represents about 40% of U.S. energy production. The reason is that because American people drive longer mileages. They are using cars which have big engines compared to other countries. But on this note, we expect no transport demand growth in the United States energy demand growth in the coming 5 years. The reason why is that actually efficiency standards play an important role. Actually, American behavior in terms of car ownership and to choice of cars and the efficiency standards, which are very good, is significantly contributed to this efficiency improvements. There's a long way to go, obviously, but that's there. The fuel standards, the renewable fuel standards and the changes in the policy in the last week, which is not in our forecast, in terms of allowing the sale of ethanol throughout the year rather than 8 months, which was in our accelerated case, actually, and which will change the market. I think it's an important development, but it's, again, on the conventional biofuel side. On the advanced biofuel side, the policies are not really, are missing at the federal level. California has a new policy that is basically put a kind of a mandate on the advanced biofuels, which is a very important development. And but I'm going to repeat it again. Without policies at both federal, state, or whatever level you can imagine of, it's very, very difficult to make that advanced biofuel into the market, which we really need to decarbonize the sectors which are very difficult to decarbonize or electrify.
I would just, this gets back to the original question I asked. I would just add a cautionary note here, which is, if you see, at least in renewables and electricity, if you see a shift away from sort of more administrative command and control policy frameworks, that sort of general thought of where you are on the policy spectrum is probably going to be and continue to be a major driver in biofuels. There is a tremendous amount of criticism of the RFS as an administrative mechanism, which is why I asked why we didn't see a similar shift away from these administrative command and control mechanisms in biofuels. But you mentioned California, I think Oregon, and a few other, British Columbia, have not mandates or administrative controls, but carbon intensity standards.
Yes.
Which essentially set the carbon intensity standard, and then you let the market figure out what fuel meets that standard. And I think that is more commensurate with the kind of policy shift you see in renewables in electricity, away from the administrative command and control to more market-driven and competitively driven structures.
I'm sure you would just reinforce that. I think that if we have more performance-based standards in our policies and are achieving what is it that we want out of the sector, and then let development take place to identify what would be the options underneath that performance umbrella, that I think we've learned is a better approach than what has been the renewable fuel standard approach.
But one question that I have to both,
yes.
Is it more difficult to set politically, to set that kind of policy, setting a target than a mandate? Of
course.
I think, I mean, in my opinion, it's more difficult politically possible. I don't know if there are a lot of examples, but
sure, and I think, you could have a long discussion about the what drives approaches to policy setting in different contexts, the U.S., local levels, Brazil, et cetera. At least in the United States, you definitely see a sensitivity toward trying to move away from specific administrative supports or technology-specific subsidies and financial mechanisms. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to move the other way and set those carbon intensity standards or move away from what exists to a new structure. Do we have any other thoughts? Before we do take another question, I just wanted to add another thought here. It gets back to the question about distributed. So another big message that comes out of this report is the move toward more distributed energy, particularly on the solar side. But when you're talking about renewables, you are talking about, to a large degree, distributed resources, modular resources that can be placed anywhere. This is a major theme everywhere, right? I mean, we are really moving toward much more decentralized and distributed energy system broadly. That doesn't mean that large centralized systems or facilities are going away, but clearly the trend is toward more distributed and decentralized. And one of the biggest drivers is customers. this sort of customization of everything, and JB and I were talking about this earlier, right? You obviously have seen it in a variety of different industries, in computing, in telecoms, in publishing, in everything, right? A great deal of tendency toward personalization, customization, meeting customers' needs, this sort of retail mentality. And that is coming, it is coming to energy. It is coming to energy, and it is being done in energy, and it will come to electricity specifically. This sort of move toward meeting customers' needs, meeting their energy choices, lowering their costs. And that extends to emerging market countries, to rural areas, to urban areas. It's part of, I think, a broader trend that we agree on here, that we see everywhere across the economy toward decentralization of everything, and the customization of everything.
And one point on that, there is it's a change in the utilities as well. It used to be that utilities were just sending a bill, and that's it. Everyone hated utilities. There are many people who hate their utilities because it's expensive. It's becoming more and more expensive. You do not understand. And utilities were just billing agencies. Now they are changing towards actually playing an important role in the distributed generation, because there are opportunities. First of all, we looked at it, how much money they will lose just for self-consumption. Just if people are putting PV and self-consuming, I'm not even talking about selling the excess electricity. And then we calculated that in just 5 years it will triple to 12 billion a year. Losses, pure self-consumption, with very conservative assumptions that we took at the IEA. And, but when you look at what does this mean in terms of the overall bill collection business in the world, it's less than 0.3%. Okay, nothing. But
it's less than, so the revenue lost from deploying distributed systems is less than 0.5% of total retail sales. So in other words, why are the utilities worried about it if it's such a small hit? But obviously that depends on where you are. And it depends on how much solar is being deployed within a particular utility's franchise area and/or region.
Exactly. In some parts of the South Australia, there's a rooftop PV penetration is about 60% today. So which means that 6 out of 10 roofs have PV panels. Then that utility in that district obviously losing out of money, but what that utility is doing is just trying to sell distributed PV, aggregate them, and selling them to the electricity market back. So in the excess areas,
if you can't beat them, join them.
Exactly. That's the changing world.
I just would offer, though, too, because we have experienced that decentralization in other important services, in computation, in communication. We do a lot now with systems that are really built for our personal use rather than the old approach. And I think in those cases, the entities that were willing to adapt and could make changes to recognize that larger objective, and that can be in all countries throughout the world, when those entities were confronted, if they adapted, they survived. If they didn't adapt, they were either bailed out by the government, let's hope that's not the model, or they were replaced. And, you know, if the utilities of whatever kind, communication, whatever, if they're not willing to adapt to what are the newer rules of the road, so to speak, that is much more customization, I think that their loss is not something that I think we need a lot of crocodile tears over.
It's an opportunity.
That's right. It is precisely right. It's an opportunity.
And many companies, utilities now, are establishing new companies outside of there and calling them in very sexy names.
Yes.
And actually, actually changing their names and just doing research on how they can build this business model, parts of the world. And it's not, once you have the business model, your customers are everywhere. You sell efficiency combined with PV. I mean, it's a different business model. You just changed it and make money out of it, and it's happening today in many European countries. All these like big utilities that people used to basically like just sign them a contract are using new companies to use the IT infrastructure and
Well,
so on and so forth.
they're adapting to the customerization of everything. They're not selling purely a commodity anymore. They're selling services.
Exactly.
They're moving to a services-based model, just like everything else in the economy.
And pay-as-you-go in Africa is every bit as relevant on that customization as, so, you know, you're going to find different ways in which this is going to express itself. And so I think we're in agreement, both we're going to see decentralization and it's an opportunity. And is that fair, Jaime? That's
It is definitely a big opportunity, also a black box that it can, it can grow very fast and
yeah.
Add it to your blind spots.
yeah.
Are there any other questions from the floor? We're approaching time. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jaime. I think that we sort of can draw a few major themes. I think we just summarized a couple of them. The movement toward distributed and decentralization, the importance of bioenergy, and just more broadly, certainly the importance of establishing the correct policy and administrative and regulatory frameworks to deploy more renewable energy so we can help meet 1.5 targets, keeping temperature increases below 1.5. And certainly the broader just celebration of renewables, that there is great progress and great potential for renewables to play a key role in the decarbonization process going forward. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Jaime, for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
And JB, thank you very much for joining us as well. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.